Okay, this is all dry now. And like I say, it has this brown oxidation on it. You can see it picking up off of my fingers. Don't wipe that off. I mean, it'll come off on your hands real easy. But that's okay. You're going to get a little dirty here. What we want to do now is we want to set that oxidation. And I'm going to do that with this bit here. So, probably be best to go outside, but I'll do this inside. Just take your depth. And spray it. Make sure you get both sides. Turn her upside down. And then just let that dry. You'll note that I took the wire back out of that loop. You have to do that to be able to thread it through the hands of your wood carving, okay? So we'll let that set just a minute and dry. Okay, this has had a chance to dry. You can test that just by rubbing your hands, see if any of that brown stuff comes off. It won't. It doesn't. So we're good to go. Because the last thing we want is when we're threading that through this fellow's hand, we don't want any of this brown crap to come off and ruin his hand. But before we do that, let me point out one more thing, being as we've got two different types of how we're going to put the lasso in their hands. This one here, he's holding his lasso in both hands. So when you're doing this type, make sure you put the lasso in the figure's hands the way it is in real life. Don't do it backwards, because some cowboy's going to come walking by your table and see it, and he's going to say, oh, look at this guy, he don't know what the hell he's doing. He's got the lasso in his hands backwards. So anyway, in a real lasso, he'd walk by my table and you'd see me do that and you'd say, look at that jerk, he doesn't know what the hell he's doing either, which is probably true. So anyway, these nylon lassos, they have a tendency of getting away from you. Anyway, there we go. Here's your loop. Let me get me a bigger loop here. So when he throws this, he wants to throw it out there and catch that cow. So when he's holding it, he wants to hold it correctly. So notice how I'm holding it here. I'm holding it with that loop down, going down, not like this. Okay, that's important. And then you just gather up the excess in the other hand, just like that character over there. All right? Now with this little fella here, you can see what I'm talking about here? See how he's got that loop right there in front? Now this little fella here, he don't have to worry about that, because all he's doing is he's holding that lariat just like that, okay? So this is going to be easy to do, but we still have to get it into his hand the correct way. So to do that, I'm going to have to switch over here and sit down. And Judy's going to have to bring the camera over here, so we'll cut for a little bit. Okay, now we're going to thread the rope or the wire through his hand. But before we do that, I want to point out the grain joining down. So this little area right in here, his fingers are in a cross grain situation. So this is extremely fragile right in here. So we have to be very careful as we thread this wire in there. Just remember that. Hate to ruin a carving here at the very last stage of it. So anyway, we want this loop coming forward. So we go and we find the end of our rope and we want to run it through this way first. Just like that. like that. And then we want to run it up through the loop like that and pull it through there without getting a kink into it. Sometimes it gets kind of rough to do, but you can do it. Once you get beyond this stage, it's downhill. At least I hope it is. Spin this around there. Almost there. There we go. All right, we got that through there. Now, that was the hard part. Now we just continue sticking this through there. Just loop it over and over and over again. Like I say, be real careful that you don't bust those fingers. So just support your carving as you're doing this, okay? So Judy will go away for a bit, and when you come back, I should have it all thread in there. Well, I've finally got it all through there. It takes a little while, you just have to be careful. Now the last step, you've got it into his hand now. The last step is to make sure you don't have any odd shaped loops. So just take a moment and go through your loops and bend them all back to where they're nice and round. There's one in there that needs to be straightened out a bit. Looks good. And then hold them right where you want them. You'll always end up with this one little hanger right here. So what I do with those is I take them and I put them on the inside of the lariat, back behind in there, to where they're hidden and not sticking out to where they can get poked. And as a last step, what I do is holding it together, get my loop, see there's my loop right there. I'm going to take a clothespin, put it on there like that, take a clothespin, put it on there like that, to hold everything together, just like I want it, okay? Now he looks pretty good like that, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix me up some clear epoxy. Don't use super glue or anything like that, use epoxy. And I'm going to kind of twist this out of the way, and with the toothpick I'm going to force some epoxy down inside his hand there and then coat these wires real good with it too, but not so much that you take away the definition of the wire. You still want that to show up. And then we'll glue that into place. Okay, I've got my epoxy here. This is just some 5-minute epoxy that I bought down at the home center. You might not have this brand, but there's probably a 5-minute epoxy down there. It's just a 2-part epoxy. You mix it equal parts. I'm going to squeeze me out a little puddle here. It doesn't take much. That'll be more than enough. Another little puddle. And then stir them together real good with your toothpick. Like that. Now, lay everything just like you want it. Like I say, just kind of lift that wire up and force that epoxy back in there. Takes a little bit of work in it, but you'll get it back in there, I have no doubt. Alright, we've got it in there. I hope you can see that. Judy said it didn't look like it was in focus. Now we just sort of sit and wait for that stuff to go off. Okay? Don't be impatient, like me sometimes. It's the next morning. I've let this set overnight just to make sure that that epoxy sets up. Don't want to rush things. So I'll take my clothespins off, and there's his lariat. Looks pretty good. Now, one of the last things I want to do is I want to make sure that everything is the way it's supposed to be, and I want to get these loops as round and in shape as possible before I paint them. So I'll just take a second here and bend those. There's one there. Like that. Another thing you can do is up here where it comes out of his hand, you can kind of bend that in just a little to give it more of a oval appearance, especially going into his hand up here. Another thing that I did is when I was putting this in here, while that depth sets that oxidation quite a bit, it probably won't set it completely. So as I was feeding in his lariat into the hand, this area here got pretty dirty from that brown that came off of my fingers. But with the Q-tip and a little mineral spirits, being as this was already varnished with the polyurethane, it just washed right off of there. So that was no problem. So now what we're going to do is we're going to paint this lariat, and it's just going to take a second, and it's very easy to do as soon as I find my paint. Here it is. We're going to use, not that one, we're going to use mudstone again. Remember, we used mudstone on his hat. So I'm going to shake this up. Squeeze me out a little bit here. Like that. And I'm not going to wet my brush. We're going to dry brush that on there. So I'm going to get a little in my brush here. Work it up in there. Find me a piece of paper here to wipe my brush out on. Do is just brush out as much of that paint out as your brush as you can, and then just come in here and lightly brush this. You don't want to get down into the grooves of the rope because that will ruin the effect of it. So you can see it's going to change it, and don't try to get way back in there in the hand because it's not necessary. See how this light just sort of blends back into nothing back in there? That's fine. That creates a shadow effect back in there, and it looks good. So just leave it. And you don't have to get every piece of rope covered with the same amount of paint. A little variation looks fine. And you just continue doing this until you get the highlights. See, each time I go back it gets a little lighter. Continue doing it until you get the look you're after. Like I say, be careful with it. Don't make sure you brush out most of that paint from your brush or you're going to get a big glob on there and it's just not going to look good. So I'll continue doing this, and in a minute we'll see what it looks like when it's all finished. I'm doing this. Okay, I got it just the way I want it. Now I'm just going to dry it a little here. It'll dry real quick because we just dry brushed that paint on there, and there's really not much dampness to it. And as a final step, I'm going to spray on a little bit of this Tester's Dull Coat. What is it? What this is? It's a flattening agent. It's just clear lacquer, but it gives a real flat appearance to it. Now everything's been varnished except for that little rope there. So it's not going to take much. I just want to kind of protect that acrylic paint on there. It's not going to hurt if you get a little on your figure. That'll be plenty. Now I'll quickly dry that. You can see how this stuff works. See where it's shiny there, where it's got a lot of stuff? Look at it go flat. See, it just totally kills any shine. A little excess right there. That's what fingers are for. So there he is. Now we have his lariat all painted. The only thing left are the spurs, and we'll do that in the next video.